My name is Patrick Kinney. I'm a professor at Columbia University in New York, and I head the Climate and Health program there. I'm very happy to have a diverse panel, and I would invite you all to come up. I'll sit at the very end, maybe. Go ahead. Jean-Paul. And I know that, Jean-Paul, you need to go. Jean-Paul, you have to leave shortly, yeah, so I will let you start off with some comments. The format will be each of our roundtable participants will make a few comments, 5 minutes, let's say, in turn, and then we will open up for general questions. Please try to keep your comments to your main points, because obviously the time has become fairly short. I'd like to start with Jean-Paul because I know you have time constraints.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm sorry if I cannot stay for the roundtable, but I have to rush to the main conference for the introductory comments. I will make some comments which I think apply to the specific issue of climate and health, but are more general in the context of a conference. So I'm basically testing what I'm going to say in a few minutes to the whole group of scientists. The first point, because as you know, the ERD is a specialized public research organization which has the specificity to be devoted only to work with developing countries. We all have a similar sister organization or brother organization called CIRAD, but which operates only in the field of agriculture. Well, my first message is that the question of the partnership with the scientists in developing countries is not only, or not even mainly, a question of transfer of knowledge, of transfer of technology. It's really that if we don't work with them, we won't be able to do the right science and to make science advance, okay? Let me take just one example. It's outside the field of health, but I'm from Marseille. We had the Mediterranean conference recently. If you want to understand at least a little bit what's happening to understand the climate in the Mediterranean, you have to understand the relationship between the atmosphere and the water in the Mediterranean Sea. And in order to understand that, you have to take into account what happens in the sub-Saharan Africa and intertropical zone. If you don't do that, you don't understand anything, okay? So that's very important to do the work with our partners in the South, not only because we are nice and we want to transfer, but because if we want to do right science in climate change, we need their help. Fine, that's the first point. The second point, and I don't want to come, I will be very quick because we already discussed with some of the previous people who intervene. It's very important because it's not at all accepted that support to science and research, and especially support to data collection, longitudinal data collection, monitoring of the environment, of the health of the population, should be included in the agenda of a negotiation. It's not something that should be left to research budget and so on. Because if we don't have the longitudinal data, we won't be able to improve the knowledge and to improve the models. Because one of the reasons all models in climate are wrong is that one of the reasons is that they don't have enough empirical parameters to fuel them. Okay, and some of the GIEC, of the IPCC models are based on very, very limited data, even on the most basic parameters of climate. Okay, in the Mediterranean, it's a good example. That's the second point. And the third point, third and fourth, and the final related point, goes back to what my friend the other Jean-Paul just said, is that it's clear that the focus, well, science is also important to help the negotiation, because the key of the negotiation is that basically developing countries, and especially the poorest ones, say, well, we didn't contribute to carbon dioxide emissions. And for example, India has a lot, if you put it in historical perspective, India has a lot of property rights on future emissions compared to us in France or even to China and so on. So we really have to help them find a solution. And you know, I don't have time to do so, to detail, but there are solutions that are directly inspired. For example, in our agriculture can better stock the carbon, or things in the field of health to limit the diffusion of infectious disease and so on. That could be win-win solution. And finally, this is very, and I think it's, well, let me say that. I understand that we may have different opinions about the Greek vote last night, okay? But I think this vote, as many other things, and Jean-Paul also talked about it, should emphasize the fact that we need to relate the agenda. Frankly, I don't know how we can say that we're going to fight climate change if we don't say at the same time that a world in which 1% of the world population controls more than half of total wealth, which is not only income, but land, capital, buildings, everything, the total wealth. And that's the IMF which says that, not me, okay? Not a leftist economist, IMF, okay? It's impossible. I mean, how can you do that? How can you implement the major solutions to climate change and global change without changing this incredible concentration of wealth? It's impossible. Nobody can say that seriously. So we need to relate the agenda. It's not a political, well, of course it's a political question, but it's a basic scientific fact, okay? A scientific fact of economics and social science, maybe, but it's a basic fact. I'm finished.
Hi, so I'm Shamila Nair-Bedouelle. I'm head of the Ozone Action Montreal Protocol in the UN Environment Program, United Nations Environment Program based here in Paris. I'm also Director of Research at INSEM, and I thank Robert and Remy very much for inviting me. Thank you for having me here. What is the Montreal Protocol? I've heard so much today about bringing the developing countries on board and making them part of this dialogue. But the Montreal Protocol is really a living example where you have... Oh, sorry. Is this better? Thank you. It's better. Okay, so the Montreal Protocol is really a living example of how developing countries and developed countries have come together to address the issue of saving the ozone layer. You know, Mario Molino and Roland have received the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the ozone, the hole in the ozone layer. And since then, the countries developed and developing got together and put together what is called the Montreal Protocol. So this protocol is really about the substances that deplete the ozone layer. And what are these substances? The CFCs, the HCFCs. You open your fridge every day. Have you ever thought about the gases that the fridge runs on? We all have air conditioning here. All this is run on those refrigerants. And these are the refrigerants that create holes in the ozone layer and breaks down the O3, the ozone. And so the world got together, and 197 countries, a universal declaration on saving the ozone layer. So it is possible where you can bring together developed and developing countries. And this is the first multilateral environmental agreement which actually respects what is called the CBDR, common but differential responsibilities, and enabling developing countries to phase out these ozone-depleting substances according to national priorities, national development plans. So the Montreal Protocol brought together this entire community to save the ozone layer. But what was the driving force behind it? The driving force was really health and the environment. Why the health? If we have a thinned ozone layer, we have much more UV that reaches the surface of the Earth. And what happens then? You have no phytoplankton in the oceans, you have very decreased biodiversity, but you kill all life on Earth. You kill you and me, you kill the human beings, if you don't have a protected ozone layer. We have to date, the Montreal Protocol has, according to the US EPA, estimates saved over 300 million cases of cancers. We have 16 million people who die every year because of cataracts. We have a lot of immune suppression diseases. We have heard today about the problems that climate change is causing. Well, if you decrease the ozone layer and you have so much UV coming on board, you increase the warmth of the Earth and the surface of the Earth. And this also contributes to, well, this is part of the climate change and the warming. So the Montreal Protocol has had multiple benefits, not just protecting life on Earth, but also protecting the ecosystems and protecting human health in terms of direct, that is decreasing skin cancers and cataracts, but also in the indirect effects. And what would these be? Well, we have the cold food chain. And we need to have proper refrigeration systems, air conditioning, or you would never have an operation, you'd never have health benefits or health services, you would never go to a hospital. So therefore, these are the indirect effects. And I think the alternative technologies, which the Montreal Protocol is promoting now, when you phase out these HCFCs, what are the technologies you put into place? So we work with 148 developing countries, receiving funds from the Multilateral Fund, which to date received $3.8 billion from donors, the highest ever financial mechanism for climate change environmental agreement, $3.9 billion, in order to assist countries to put in place proper technologies. When you phase the HCFCs out, what do you phase in? How do you phase them in? What capacity do you need? How would you look at the environmental, socio-economic development of a country because of the effects of climate change? So I think we've heard a lot of these discussions here today, and a lot of this comes together in the Montreal Protocol, and I really encourage everybody to look at this. So we'll be glad to share this with you. We put out now some how the Montreal Protocol protects health, and there's a big meeting taking place in Paris also in July, where we hope that Remy, on behalf of INSERM, would participate. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the Montreal Protocol as it is phasing out these ozone-depleting substances. One of the default phase-in is the high global warming potential HFCs, which is a greenhouse gas controlled under Kyoto. So for the first time, the Kyoto people and the Montreal people are talking to each other. So I think besides the health benefits, we have a number of environmental benefits, and it's really a living example and a lesson to be learned for climate change negotiators. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's move the mic to Sylvie. Please introduce yourself, and well, I guess you have already, but maybe again, and be very interested in your...
I am Director de Recherche at CNRS, and I am directing this GIS Climat Environnement Société, which is a consortium. It's not a geographical information system. It's a groupement d'intérêt scientifique, so a consortium on climate, environment, and health, and we have the mission to develop interdisciplinary dimension of climate change. So I have 3 points I wanted to stress. The first one, and it happened that Jean-Paul Moatti mentioned it, is the issue of the data. There is really clearly the issue that for climate we need long-term, we need health requires multifactorial, so it's often quite complex, and part of the information may be missing, and the access, but we already discussed that, so I'm not going to go more in depth on this. Second point is the issue on, there is a lot of research needed. Really, when we started, I don't think I had the vision how complex this issue of climate and health is. And there is really a need for integrated approaches combining ecology, health, climate, and socio-systems. So it's really a big challenge. It's really a very good example of integrated research. There are not that many that requires that much integration. And so for this, there is a need to develop interdisciplinary research, and the experience we have clearly shows that this requires time. This requires preparation so that the different disciplines understand each other. There was a colleague of mine working with Pat, with epidemiologists, mentioned that even between statisticians coming from climate or statisticians coming from epidemiology, it's not the same language. They even had difficulty to understand each other. And there is a need to have targeted calls, because it is so integrating that if you just let like this, I'm not sure it will occur, it will happen. So that's a challenge, that's an issue that it needs to be targeted to happen. The third point, and it has been mentioned also, is health as a key issue, health and climate change as a key issue for policy, with the possible co-benefits, which is important for mitigation, and several aspects where it really could help on the policy aspect, but it has also been mentioned. So my main point would be this interdisciplinary approach, and that if we do not target it, it doesn't happen. That's the experience we had with this consortium, where since it was our focus, then people started to work on that. Otherwise, I'm not sure that they would have started like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvie. I think the GIS consortium is one of the great examples of this kind of focused initiative that's been very successful, even on a relatively small scale, but generating a lot of new interesting research. Let's pass off to you.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Aisha Alfa. I'm Deputy Director at the Health and Environment Alliance. We're a non-profit organization. We're an alliance of over 70 organizations from the health and medical sector based in Brussels, working on a range of environmental health issues, but certainly climate change and health has been moving up our agenda in the last years very much. So I appreciate I can be here with you and learn some more about the current research issues and the complexities and challenges around that. At the same time, I would like to bring to this discussion the question of how can we bring the science to the policymakers? How can we communicate that? Because I think there's very much a need for that, and that's my invitation for you here today to become engaged in these policy debates and bring your evidence in. The previous speaker mentioned this book and mentioned that there was this mounting denial of reality. And I would actually add on to this that there's very much a lack of urgency among the policymakers. And I think this is where you are needed, where the science is needed to actually correct that current mood that we see. And we can very much see from the existing science that we need to act urgently. The Lancet was briefly mentioned. For me, really, you know, the two messages from Lancet are so key. I mean, first of all, that climate change is a medical emergency that we actually risk. It could have potentially catastrophic outcomes, and that we risk to overturn the important health gains and the development gains that we saw, and that so many people worked so hard to get there, and it could be reversed. But at the same time, this positive message of the co-benefits and the huge co-benefits, and as you're following in the media, and as we are following with the policymakers, so much is about the money. It's about the finance, and I think this is where still our health co-benefits message isn't yet heard enough. So it's just a question of sounding a bit like a broken record all the time, but it's important to bring that message in again and again. You can actually offset a lot of your costs, by the health gains that you would have. And the other important point for me on the Lancet was that it actually, for the first time, made 10 recommendations to the policymakers, and that was very positive. And that included, one key recommendation to actually rapidly phase out coal power as a key threat to both the climate and our health, as part of a package to address air quality. And I think this is in a way an expression of a growing momentum that we have, from many researchers, health experts, to kind of what can we do, to kick our fossil fuel habit and look at the energy questions as key questions. And when we see that very much in countries that we work in the European region. So I think you as a scientist, you have a lot to bring to the policymakers who, as I said, are missing this need to do more. I've heard, some high-level policymakers say, well, even if we don't get to an agreement in Paris, it's still not the end of the process. So I think people are really, downplaying expectations. I mean, that's not something we can really afford. I mean, Paris has to become a success, and we have to have an agreement, and we also have to have a clear roadmap and, goals for actually the way ahead and, in going into decarbonization, because what we've seen now from the countries who've put their climate commitments forward, their commitments to reduce greenhouse gases, is that we know it's not going to be enough. And again, this is part of because they are not taking the health benefits, into account, or not fully into account. We've heard the G7 recently saying they want to phase out, fossil fuels by the end of the century. Again, this is, very nice talk, but it's missing this urgency. So this is where my invitation is to work together, to join the momentums that are going on. There's a big divestment movement happening all over the world. So lots of opportunities for you to become engaged. Thank you.
Thank you. That was many very important points, and I would emphasize or reinforce what you just said about the importance of getting our scientific information into the hands of policymakers. I think it's something we don't do in a very organized way, and I'm sensing that policymakers are increasingly seeing the value of this health information for making their points, but at the same time they lack the sort of latest knowledge on that topic. So I think we can really do a better job. So I'll pass it off to Claude. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Claude Flamand, and I'm the head of epidemiology unit of Institut Pasteur in French Guyana. And thank you for inviting me to this roundtable. So we have seen a lot of excellent presentation about infectious disease, specifically vector-borne disease, and studying the climate change on vector-borne disease is a very big challenge, because we know that epidemic dynamics are driven by very complex interaction between intrinsic and extrinsic factors. So anyway, climate variability is postulated to be one of the most determinant, of the most important determinants that influence the distribution of vector-borne disease. So now I'm very aware about the fact that a large part of the published work and about our studies are focusing on studying the relationship between meteorological and climatic factors on disease incidence or vector population in affected areas. But that's clear that climate change represents a real threat for countries that consider to be safe today. We have some example about chikungunya in Europe, or in the introduction of this virus in Americas. Now we are Zika virus in Brazil, and that represents a threat for the introduction in the rest of Americas. Another point is that even if research projects includes various disciplines, such as epidemiologists, entomologists, dynamic transmission modelers, or climatologists, meteorologists, it can be very difficult sometimes to model the impact of long-term effect of climate change if the drivers that we identified are not included in the climate change scenario. So anyway, studying the impact of climate variability in short-term process can be very useful for the public health decision makers, and I want to emphasize a little more the importance of the partnership with the public health decision makers. And as example, in French Guyana, we have a research project, and we have the chance to have the regional health agency in the project and the French Institute for Public Health Surveillance at the beginning and the conception of the project. And now we are able to predict 80% of the dengue outbreaks using climatic factors such as SST or sea levels pressure. And we just have also entomological risk maps, and now the regional health agency can use this kind of data in order to understand how to orientate the vector control teams. So that's really important to work with them at the beginning of the development of the project to bring the findings of research project in the policymakers. Yes.
Thanks very much for that. Do we have time to open up for questions? Comments too. The audience has been very patient. We had a few chances for questions, but now's an opportunity to either pose questions to the panel or make your own comments, which would be very welcome.